fathers of Judaism. And they all three were aliens in the land where they lived. And when their descendants, the children of Israel, moved into Egypt, they were aliens there. Pharaoh welcomed them and gave them a territory to occupy, but it didn't belong to them. They were foreigners there. That's the history of these homeless Hebrews up to this point. They were foreign people who were welcomed into a land that was not theirs. What a concept, right? Yeah. But their situation drastically changed. Our text picks up centuries later, after Joseph and his family were all dead and buried. There was a new Pharaoh in control. And he didn't remember anything about Joseph or how he had saved Egypt. This Pharaoh didn't know how the Hebrews came to live in Goshen, that they were welcomed there, that the land was offered as a place for them to live. All this Pharaoh knew was that there were a lot of Hebrews, there were a lot of foreigners in the land. And because he was fearful and paranoid, he began to oppress them. He ordered all the foreign baby boys to be murdered as a way of reducing the foreign population. And he forced all the work-riddled Hebrews into slavery as a means of controlling their lives and degrading them. They were under his power, and Pharaoh wanted them to know who was in charge. And because he could, he made their lives miserable, terribly, horribly miserable. It was into this very desperate situation then that God sent a savior, a man named Moses. His ordination came at a burning bush, and his mission, his ministry was to take the children of Israel out of Egypt back to that land of Canaan that had been promised to their ancestor Abraham. So the narrative of Moses is probably one of the best known stories in the Old Testament, and I think that's probably because of the movie, The Ten Commandments, that we see on television every year at Passover. I only read a very small portion of the story for you this morning. It spans 4 books in the Bible. So that's Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I know you've been keeping up with your reading assignment, and that's an awful lot to read. And I'm going to tell you, there's not a whole lot in Leviticus and Numbers that's going to turn you on. So read the book of Exodus this week, all right? Just give it a quick glance over to remind you about all of Moses' story, but I think that you probably remember a good portion of it, at least the highlights. So I want to give you a little quiz this morning to see how much you remember. I could tell you the story again, but I would rather you tell it to me. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you some multiple choice questions, and you can just shout the answer back. All right? Sound easy enough? Everybody's into play, right? All right. For those of you who are visual learners, we have some pictures, okay, to kind of guide you along and hold your attention. So, first question, we're going to try to time this. I'm going to hold up my finger every time Alan's going to switch the slide. So, second slide there, Alan. What well-known national leader was saved from death when his mother put him in a basket and floated him down the Nile? Was it A, Winston Churchill, B, Donald Trump, Or C, Moses? Moses. Awesome. Good deal. All right, number 2. We got the picture? Good. What spiritual leader, I better turn this way so I can see what's going on. What spiritual leader had to flee Egypt when it was discovered that he committed murder? Was it A, the Dalai Lama, B, Jesus the Christ, or C, Moses? Moses. Very good. You guys are smart. Number 3. Who did God send into Egypt to deliver the children of Israel? Was it A, General Patton, B, General Custer, or C, Moses? Moses. That's not so hard. I know you're having some difficulty, but it's not too bad. But this next question is it's pretty tricky. So you remember the 10 plagues, right? When Pharaoh wouldn't allow the children of Israel to leave Egypt, God sent a series of 10 plagues. And the last plague, Alan, was the plague of death. So here's your question. Listen very carefully. This one's a little tricky. Whose son died during the plague of death? Was it A, the son of Moses, B, the son of Pharaoh, or C, the son of Yul Brynner? Pharaoh. Very good. All right, number 5. Who led the children of Israel across the Red Sea? Was it A, the United States Army, or B, Moses? Moses. You get the feeling there's kind of a repetitive answer here, right? All right, number 6. Who received the 10 Commandments from God? Was it A, Moses, or B, is that it? Oh, whoops, go back. You can't really see his face. Go back one now, I'm sorry. It was Charlton Heston. And the right answer is? Moses. Good. And number 7, your last question. How long did it take Moses and the children of Israel to travel through the wilderness? Was it A, 40 minutes, B, 40 days, C, 40 months, or D, 40 years? 40 years. Indeed it was, 40 years. You've watched that movie before, I take it. 40 years. You know, we can understand that number in a couple of ways. We can interpret it as a literal 40 years, but we can also understand it figuratively, or I'll say biblically. And you don't have to give up one understanding in order to grab hold of the other. So biblically speaking, the number 40 represents the fullness of time, or the completeness of a time. So if we say something took 40 days or 40 years, what we're saying is that that event took as long as it needed to take in order for it to be complete, to be finished. It took as long as was necessary for God's purpose to be fulfilled in it. In other words, Moses led those folks around the wilderness until what God intended to do in them and through them and for them was complete. They walked until they didn't need to walk anymore. They walked until the journey was complete. However, what's really important to the story is not how long the journey took, but where the journey took place. Moses and that community of foreigners made their journey through the wilderness, right? The wilderness. Have you ever traveled through a wilderness? You know those episodes in life when it feels like someone took you out to the desert and then just sort of left you there? maybe the wilderness came up under your feet when something very tragic happened to you or to someone you loved. Or maybe you kind of wandered into the wilderness following a series of bad decisions and unfortunate events. Or maybe you just woke up there one morning, kind of out of touch, right?
Amen. Wondering
where you were, wondering where God was, wondering how to find your way to, just to anywhere. I don't know, church, I don't know if all of our wilderness journeys have a specific purpose. But in the text I read from Deuteronomy, it says that God took Israel through the wilderness in order to purify their hearts and to turn their hearts towards God and to inspire their hearts to follow God's commandments. And sometimes our treks through the desert work in that same way. They purify our hearts and they turn us towards God. I mean, if we're willing to look for God in those wilderness places, then they become for us a very transformative journey. If we're willing to let them take as long as they need to take in order for God to do what God intends to do in us and through us and for us, then they bring us to a fertile land on the other side of all that barrenness. Because if we are looking for God, we will find God. And that's a fact, my friend. But whether or not we're looking for God, God always knows where we are. God can't not see us. That's just God's nature. So regardless of how we feel in those desert wastelands, regardless of what we do or who we are looking for or what we hope to find among the sand dunes and the cacti, God knows us and God walks with us all the way through the desert. After 40 years in the wilderness, after all that dry dust and parched air and harsh sun and blistering heat, Yahweh reminded Israel, while you were in the desert, your garments never wore out. And while you were there, the whole time, your feet never did swell up. Now, how is it that you could spend 40 years in a wilderness in the scorching hot sun and your clothes not wear out? You know what the sun does to your clothes, right? How is it that your feet wouldn't swell if you were walking across hot, dry, desert ground? My feet swell from here to the office. It's an emphatic statement, though. You see, when everything signaled defeat for Israel, when time and the environment and the very forces of nature were against them, God was with them and for them to guide their path and to direct the journey. They had to go through the wilderness in order to get back to Canaan. That's just a given. There wasn't really anything else in between. They had to go, regardless of the time it took. They had to go through the wilderness to get back to Canaan. But in the process of that expedition, no matter how undesirable it may have been at times, no matter how difficult it was for them, they discovered God there. They came to know Yahweh in a way they had never known before. And who they came to know was this relenting presence. It went out before them. You remember the story. God went out before them in a pillar of, what was it? Fire? Yeah. God followed behind them in a cloud of smoke, in a big cloud. And eventually God dwelt right in their midst. When they put together the tabernacle, God dwelt right in their midst, never to leave. To always be there, to provide for them, and to direct their journey. The truth is, wilderness is a necessary part of our spiritual growth because it's just a natural part of life. We're going to face them, and hopefully we'll grow through them. I can promise you it's not for your destruction that you find yourself in the hot, dry desert. It just happens to be the only way to the land of promise. But in the process of the expedition, no matter how undesirable it may feel at times, no matter how difficult